Today, we are in our 5th training webinar, and we are focusing on understanding and measuring impacts. Our team today is me, Claire Buckley, and I work for Julie's Bicycle, and I've been working with the arts and culture for over 10 years now on developing understanding, measuring impacts, and developing all kinds of lovely approaches to climate action. And I'm also joined by Brecon Byron from Native Events, who is very ably supporting in the background and is also going to be providing some further information in the chat as well. We are in the 5th of our online training sessions. This one focusing on understanding and measuring impacts, and you can see all of the other ones, the 4 other sessions we've done so far, and the sessions coming up after this. If you have joined the sessions up to now, we very much hope they will have given you an understanding of a few key things, and that's what an environmental policy and an action plan should cover, what you should be focusing on in terms of your environmental actions and impacts, how to go about developing your policy and plan, and who to involve in the process and how. We tried to really develop the webinars to follow on from each other, but also to be relatively standalone. And I would like to, just curious to see of those of you attending, if you've been to all of them, or if this is your first one, just to get a sense of the extent to which you've been following through on the webinars. It's not a test, you know. We're not doing a list of attendance. Okay, we're almost there with the answers. Brecon, do you want to share the results? Okay, that's great. So a few of you are here for the first time, so you're very welcome. In particular, nearly, excuse me, some of you, about a third of you, have done the 3 key webinars, which are very much designed as a foundational package. A couple of you have done 2, and a few of you have even done 4. So that's great. That's really helpful for us to understand. Thank you. If you didn't join those first sessions, please do remember you can access all of the recordings and the slides and the different templates on that Arts Council Climate Action resource page as well. So what are we hoping for today? The aims of the session really have 2 key aims. And the first is for you to go away from this session with a real sense of how to go about building your understanding and measuring your impacts. We are going on the assumption that those of you joining are a bit earlier on in the process. And the second key thing that we would really hope you come away with from today is an idea of the different ways of developing understanding and measuring impacts, which go beyond that carbon metric, which is one key metric, but it is not the only one. What we're going to cover very briefly, what's the point, what's the benefit of understanding and measuring your impacts, what are the different ways to start building your understanding, how to measure your impacts and your footprints. We've got lots of examples and some tools and resources which can help you along the way, and a few words about the do's and don'ts. And then when we finish that bit, we'll stop the recording and get some time for Q&A. I would say a couple of words, just a reminder in terms of what the Arts Council is asking SFOs and arts centres to provide that policy and plan next January when you're signing your funding agreement. There is no requirement to make those policies or plans public, and the Arts Council is not planning to ask organisations to submit environmental data or carbon footprints next year. It will probably come at a later stage, but for now they are asking for policies and plans in January and not the actual data. We are focusing today on developing that data and understanding, because this is a really important part of being able to figure out what you should be focusing on and then track the progress and tell that story. So it's a really key part of climate action and environmental action. So to get on to understanding and measuring your impacts, and I'm going to start with a few key kind of concepts to help you understand what that's about. But before we get into that, I know we have quite a mix of different of participants today from different types of organizations. We do have a question in terms of which of the statements best describes where you are in terms of understanding and measuring your impacts. So we can see a few of you, about a fifth, are just starting to think about it, and then about 2/5 are taking the first steps to develop understanding and measurements. So that's really great to know, and also a little bit of how we have designed and developed this training content. A quarter of you are already understanding and measuring some of your impacts. And then a few of you are doing that, and also have, or one of you has is planning to go further with that. And we have one participant who's top level comprehensive understanding and measurement of all key impacts, and somebody else has put in other. If that person would like to put in the chat what they meant by other, that would be great. Oh, sorry, I'm not sure if you were able to see those results. That might help. Thank you. I'll just say everybody has answered the other the other category. Nope, not yet. Okay. So a few words about the point of all of this. What is the benefit of understanding and measuring impacts? We have, sorry, I'm just checking so we had an answer to that other question. So it helps with a few key things. Sometimes organizations go, right, I'm going to measure my impacts, I'm going to do my footprints, and that is it, job done. But what is really important is what you actually do with that understanding and that information and that data. And the benefits are, there's quite a few benefits. It can help you with identifying priorities. If you have a sense overall of your impacts, but you know where the biggest ones lie and the ones over which you have most control, that will help you to set your priorities. You can't do everything all at once. It can also help in setting targets. If you do have some really specific data, like on your energy use or how much waste you're generating, and when you have a good sense of that, it makes it a lot easier to set some targets. Understanding measuring impacts also helps to inform action. If, for example, you've done an energy audit and you've identified particular areas of higher energy use or particular problems, it can help to inform your action plan. The next benefit is about tracking progress. So if you're establishing this information and understanding, measuring impacts, if you start to do that over time and do it in a comparable way, it can help you see how are you doing, and can also help you make the link cause and effect. Are your actions actually helping to reduce those impacts? Understanding and measuring impacts also can really help in telling your story. You may want to tell your story to funders, your audiences, your partners, collaborators or the artists you're working with. And it can really very much demonstrate good practice, again, to funders or to audiences, for example. So before you dive in to going, oh, quick, I need to get all my data, I need to do carbon footprints, I would say absolutely take a step back and start at the beginning. Look at the key areas of impact that you've identified, which are relevant and meaningful in terms of who you are, where you are, what you do, and who you're doing it with. And then of those impacts, think about the ones that you most want to understand. And if you are starting at the beginning, also the ones over which you have most control. Then look at what information or data you already have or can relatively easily get. That might be energy or fuel bills, water, waste bills, travel records. Every organization has that. Audience travel information. You might have some general information on audience numbers and where they're coming from. And other kind of data and information is information on your suppliers or the venues you are working with or touring to, and information such as on their environmental credentials. You can also think about how to build a wider picture. Data, quantitative data is of course really important, but what people think is also really important. For example, you might say, well, actually, how much paper we use in the office isn't really a biggie for us, but it's important to the people who to your team because they want to do something. And this is one of the more tangible things that they could do to look at paper and reducing paper usage. So find out what people think. It could be team, audiences, if you're a resource or membership organization, your members, the artists you work with, the freelancers you work with. And another thing in terms of building that wider understanding is to look at and find out about what others are doing, such as your peers, your local community, or local authorities as well. So that is the information when you've got some kind of key environmental impact data, hopefully also a bit of a wider understanding of what people think and what's going on. Then use that data and information to identify your priorities and set objectives and targets, to inform what you're doing, to track your progress. It might also help you to go, okay, we have some gaps here. People don't understand that. We need some help here. So it can help you to identify those needs. And also you can use that information to tell your story. And that could be internally in terms of sharing with your team or also externally. So start at the beginning. The most commonly measured source of impacts, which we see within the arts and culture, is energy, travel and transport, water, waste, goods and materials. Some are more or less difficult depending on what you do, but you can take the information and the data from these impacts, such as your kilowatt hours of energy or your fuel, liters of diesel fuel for generators, your tons of waste, take that information and work it out as a carbon footprint. So what is a carbon footprint? I think it is a word, a term, which is much used and potentially not always much understood. And I think the first thing is that is a measure of climate change impacts of a business, a venue, an event, or an activity. And it's usually expressed as a single number, as the greenhouse gas emissions, which are associated with the activity, the business, the events, and expressed in either in kilograms or tons of either carbon dioxide, which is the main greenhouse gas, or carbon dioxide equivalent, because there are other greenhouse gases as well. And just on that, there are a number of different greenhouse gases which come from different types of activity. CO2 is the one people are most aware of, comes from fossil fuel combustion and transportation. The other ones, methane and nitrous oxide, are much more powerful gases than in terms of their global warming potential than carbon dioxide. Methane comes, for example, from your waste if it ends up in landfill. Nitrous oxide comes from manufacturing and cars, for example. So understanding that, you know, there are different activities which generate different greenhouse gases, and then what is the impact of that? Those are the gases from human activity which are contributing to the greenhouse effect and getting caught in the atmosphere and warming, resulting in an increase in global temperature rise. So that is just a little bit of kind of, you know, going from understanding a bit of what's behind the carbon footprints, the greenhouse gas emissions, and the impact that they have. Countries do their greenhouse gas emissions inventories. So this is Ireland's emissions from 2022, which was almost 61 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So those different gases expressed in carbon dioxide equivalent. And then the carbon per person, which is just under 12 tons per head of a person living in Ireland. So that's what it looks like for the country. A carbon footprint, then, you could think of it as a greenhouse gas emissions inventory for an organization, a venue, or an event. So you've got all of these different sources of information on your waste, your energy, materials, travel, transports, and you take that information and you can basically figure out what is the climate change impact, what are the associated greenhouse gas emissions of that. So this is an example here from a gallery. So how does it work? I think, again, it's not always something that people necessarily understand. So basically, you take data on your different sources of impact, how much energy you use, how far you've traveled, by what modes, and you apply what's called a carbon emissions conversion factor, which basically is how carbon intensive is that particular activity or product. And you multiply the two, and then you get your results. So this is an example here, which shows going from kilowatt hours of gas and electricity to what that is in CO2 in tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. For water, again, looking at how much water is used and how much wastewater there is, and then waste. So you can see a very simple example of basically how a carbon footprint is worked out, how those associated emissions are worked out. So this is an example based on Arts Council England's national portfolio from 22-23. And they had about 600 what they call national portfolio organizations who do some kind of reporting. And we took that information and we're like, okay, well, it's over 29 million kilometers of touring, 24 million kilometers of business travel, water use, waste use, electricity and gas use, and took all of that information and were able to work out the carbon footprint, which for that year was just under 73,000 tons. And then you can see how that splits down in terms of which are the biggest sources of impact. So that's an example just of going from that data on the left to those carbon metrics on the right. This is another example from camping festivals. From Vision 2025, Show Must Go On. And again, it's got the carbon metric in there, which you can see at the bottom, which is just over 24,000 tons of CO2 per year. But they've also worked it out into per festival goer, and they base that on diesel use, fuel use, water use, and waste generation. And they've taken those numbers and given a few key metrics. So not only the carbon metric, but also given some information about the kind of practice that the festivals have in place. Like, do they have a sustainability coordinator? Do they have some budget allocated to environmental action? So I think what I really wanted to show there was, you have that kind of initial data, you can use that to work out the carbon footprints, but there is also some key information about impact, not just that single carbon metric, but the resource use, the waste generated, the fuel use as well, which is also really important and useful. We can't talk about carbon footprinting and greenhouse gas emissions without talking about scopes. Under international kind of standards on greenhouse gas accounting, the emissions are often grouped in different scopes. So scope 1 is direct, so what you as an organization actually burn or use in terms of fossil fuels and the emissions that come directly from your activity. Scope 2 is indirect emissions from purchased electricity mainly. And then scope 3 is indirect, and that's emissions which are basically related to stuff or services that come in, that you use, and then go out. And I think sometimes people can get a bit caught up in scopes 1, 2, and 3. On a very practical level, I think what's important is what you can control and influence. The scopes approach is to avoid some double counting, basically because some people are responsible for, or some organizations are responsible for emissions generation through, for example, electricity generation. So they're already accounting for those emissions, so you account for that in a different way. It's an accounting approach, but what really matters is what you can control and influence. And in particular around scope 3, the key things for arts organizations is around travel, is business travel, audience travel. The business travel, the emissions are created and accounted for by the companies, the travel providers, transport providers, but you can also account for that, and you can also have more control and influence over that, for example, in particular if it's business travel. So this is basically a way of saying we don't tend to focus that much on scopes. It's more about understanding the source of impact and what the impact is and what you can control and influence. So a few more words about carbon footprints. It is a really useful way of understanding the impacts of tracking progress and informing action when you look at the carbon numbers, but also what lies behind. And I think another key thing is to think about kind of going a bit deeper into the information that you have an understanding, because your footprint will tell you what your impact is, but not exactly why. So I've just given some examples here. If you've been looking at your impact, say, over 2 years, if you know that the emissions of your energy use have decreased, have increased over the last year, but you know it's because you've actually been open, changed your opening hours and been open for longer. So you can understand the reason for that change. You might go, oh, we used a lot less water than last year, but we actually don't have a clue why. If you look at the example of waste, we know we generated 40 tons of waste in a year, and that's a bit less than last year, but actually our recycling rates still aren't very high. And then another example on travel is actually you may not know your travel, business travel impact, for example, but you do know how much you spend on that, and you know that's quite a big spend for your organization. So that tells you that you should be trying to find out some more. So that's just some examples of kind of digging a bit deeper and how to understand and use the information that you get. I would say also sometimes we have a tendency to think a carbon footprint is the be all and end all. There are some things that a carbon footprint won't tell you. It doesn't give you the measure of other types of impacts, such as air pollution, resource depletion, deforestation. It doesn't tell you the story of other kinds of action and change, which I think is really important for arts organizations in particular. Things that you can do that you can't neatly capture necessarily in carbon footprints around green procurement, ethical sponsorship, audience engagements. And then also you have to look at the carbon footprint and try and understand what lies behind and what you can see from the numbers which you have used to calculate it. So, for example, sometimes and often what we see is organizations reducing their footprints, but or their footprint has decreased, but it's not necessary. It's not because of something they've done. It's because the electricity supply has more renewable energy in the mix. So I think, again, when you are measuring impacts and developing new understanding, don't overly obsess with carbon footprints. There is what lies beneath and what lies beyond. So if you've got your overall, how much waste, how much was recycled, what kind of food sourcing or offering did we have? What are the sustainability credentials of our suppliers? And what are we doing around engagements? There are other ways and things to think about as well. A few words on the challenges of carbon footprinting for the arts and culture. The time and understanding to do it. Hopefully today will help, and we've got some tools and resources to show you as well. Accessing data sometimes can be difficult where you're reliant on others. For example, if your space is in a shared building controlled by your landlord, getting visitor or audience travel information can be very tricky. Continuity, being able to do a nice year-on-year comparison can be difficult if things change, if you've got different types of production, if you've got changes in your audience numbers. And the other kind of key challenge in particular for the arts is around looking at production impacts and materials, because there's so many different sources of information and databases on material impacts, but they are not very easy to access. So that is a bit of an overview. In terms of getting started with measuring your impacts, so the key things that organizations can usually measure, this will be very different. However, if you're a venue, a production, a festival, a tour, or resource organization, but usually you can get some kind of information about energy, business travel. Gets more challenging around staff commuting and audience travel, transports, water and wastewater is used for buildings-based organizations is quite common, and you can get information on volumes from your suppliers. Waste, resource and materials, and then information. So these are the key kind of things that you might think about measuring, again, depending on what you're doing. To go back to the point about thinking about what you can control and influence, especially if you're at the beginning, think about the things that are more straightforward, where you can get that information and where you have more control over that. And that might be your electricity and water use, or your fuel bills, your business travel, how much waste is generated at your building. And then there are some areas where you will be much more reliant on getting information from others. So from your transport providers, your suppliers, your waste disposal company. So for example, you'll have the information on how much waste you're generating, but actually you really need to get information from the waste service provider on what actually happens to that waste. This is an overview really of the key types of information and data that you can get depending on your activity, whether you're a venue, festival, tour, production, or office-based, and examples of the places where you can usually get that information. I am not going to go through this in detail, but I think just in terms of a straightforward approach, these are usually the areas you can get that information and the kind of information you could get. What I really would say is also try and link that information to your other kind of key metrics or numbers as an organization. So, you know, what are your audience numbers, how many performances, how many productions, you know, to be able to link that information on the impacts to your activity and also changes in activity. A few words on energy in particular. There's different types of energy. If you're working in an office and it's a shared building, that might be very challenging. If you have your own building or venue, or you manage that building, it will be a lot easier. But if you are doing events in other buildings or touring to other venues or doing outdoor events, it will also be a bit more challenging. But you definitely can get that information, and asking for it is the very important step on that. If you have some kind of renewable energy use or potentially green tariff, also think about not just how much energy used, but reporting on the source of that energy. And again, I think really important of asking for the information, getting the information. So if building energy use, you could check your invoices. Reading your meters is even better. Or you might even have some options for smart meters or building management systems that will give you that information. If you're doing outdoor events, if you're using generators, ask the generator supplier what they can tell you and ask for accurate information. If you're renting, ask your landlord. It may be tricky, and also you may not be able to do that much about it. If you were touring or using other venues, talk to those venues as well. But again, it might be tricky to get that information, and it's not the area over which you're going to have most control and influence. So you might be better off focusing on transport and travel for your touring. Here's a few resources which might help you in more specific areas. So Vision 2025 has got some wonderful tools around both fuel use and materials and waste, some really practical stuff. The Performing Arts Forum and Green Arts Initiative in Ireland did a webinar last year, which explains really in detail how to go about understanding your electricity use, really looking forensically at that, and you can find that webinar on their websites. The Creative Carbon Scotland, they've got some really specific tools around audience travel surveys as well, so you don't have to start from the beginning. And a few other resources or tools around digital impacts. The Network Condition is a nice tool for looking at the impacts of digital cultural productions. Also helps you to look at different scenarios and choices. And one of the resources provided during the roadshow we've done on reducing your digital footprint has some links to some good tools in there as well. I'm going to say a few words about the creative climate tools, which Julie's Bicycle has developed over many years, and some SFOs and art centres I know are already using them. So it's a free calculator, and it'll help you to track and understand impacts as a venue, office, tour, event, or festival. It allows you to look at different sources of impact, from energy to travel, and it will provide you with some nice reports, and you'll be able to look at how things are changing over time. You can use the tools as an office or a venue, cultural building. You can also use them for outdoor events or festivals, indoor events or festivals, tours, and then you can also kind of do a bit of a mix and match if you are an organization, for example, with a venue who does also does some festivals as well. Getting to the information you need so you can calculate and work out the impacts and do the carbon footprints, especially the first time, can take quite a bit of work. On our website, we have some data collection templates which you can use as for different types of activity. And there's also a business travel data collection template. So again, you don't have to start from the beginning. When we did the roadshow, we also provided a more straightforward starting out spreadsheets to look at electricity, heating, wastewater, and travel, and that is available on the Arts Council's website. A few other tools we've got to mention. The EPA has a tool which is looking at resource efficiency, which is also free and available to use online. And so there are a range of different tools, and we've got some great examples to show you as well. Before we get on to the examples, just a couple of things about thinking about other ways of building understanding. Beyond getting your environmental impact data and doing a carbon footprint, you can dig deeper through audits, looking at energy, waste. You can also get audits on websites these days. You can also find out what people think by doing audience surveys, or maybe team surveys, and also surveys which are more about finding out what others are doing, such as your suppliers. There are also, in terms of like the kind of information that you can get and the kind of data beyond the impact data and the carbon footprints. This is an example from Arts Council England of they've asked different organizations what are the key things they're doing, and do an annual report, which, for example, shows how many organizations are doing work around programming, environmental programming, and other examples on ethical sponsorship policies. So really a rounded picture of carbon, environmental impact, and then all the other great stuff that you can do that isn't so neatly summarizable. So a couple of examples for you, just to show from the work that we've done. The Green Arts Initiative Venues pilot project looked at measuring impacts and also gathered some other information to build understanding. And they were able to work out energy use emissions over 2 years, and to see that that had decreased, but also to look into that and to figure out why it had decreased. Partly it was energy saving measures, but partly it was because the carbon intensity of the electricity supply in Ireland had decreased. So partly because the organizations were trying to reduce it, and partly because there's wider things happening in Ireland. The Photo Museum Ireland, this is a lovely example. So they got Sustainable Energy Authority Ireland support to do an energy audit. They had a site visit and they got 12 months of data over 2 years. And they got some recommendations through the audit of what they could do to save money. And then they also got a Green for Micro grant, a €2,000 voucher, where they looked beyond their energy use and looked at their impacts across different areas and were able to develop their carbon footprints. And you can see here a nice summary of their emissions. And this helped them to identify their key areas of impact on business travel and energy. This is another example from Dublin Theatre Festival. They started with their office and their business travel footprint because that's where they were, that was the best place for them to start. And they have used our creative climate tools and worked out their carbon footprints. You can see it was 15 tons in 2021, and then on the right-hand side, what that was based on, and business travel was by far the biggest part of that. Is obviously a really challenging issue for Irish organisations. What I would say is that the festival is now developing on from that, and they're looking at other areas. They're looking at artist travel they pay for the festival, and they're also talking to the venues they're using for the festival to find out more about energy use. This is an example from a festival called Shambhala. This example, when you first looked, you go, oh my God, their carbon footprint exploded. But I just want to make the point here that sometimes when you start, you've got a bit of information. And then as you go on, your footprint will probably increase because you're beginning to understand and add other areas of impact. And that is absolutely fine. It's the understanding and what you do with it that counts. Another example from a Performing Arts Forum as a greener touring project. And they worked with 6 touring productions of very mixed, and worked out the carbon footprint of 12 tours. And they focused on travel, freight, and accommodation because this is where the touring productions could have most control. And the information which they gathered gave them some really good insights. And I think the key thing that I would say there, especially for productions and events, is getting information retrospectively can be really difficult. If you want to get decent information, plan ahead and then set it up for the next production or the next tour. Doing it retrospectively is really difficult. And I'm going to show you a little video, which is a wonderful example from a touring organization, which also very nicely explains greenhouse gas emissions.
Earlier this year, a British orchestra was invited to tour to Poland, and the musicians voted. Rather than take the plane, they decided to travel a staggering 26 hours by train.
Seriously?
We all know there is a climate crisis, but what can we do about it as an orchestra? Instead of the usual routine that starts in Heathrow, we took trains from London to Brussels, Brussels to Cologne, Cologne to Berlin, Berlin to Angermünde, and then Angermünde to Szczecin in Poland.
What difference does that make?
6.1 metric tons of CO2e.
And what is CO2e?
Okay, according to the Kyoto Protocol, there are 6 greenhouse gases: carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, sulfur hexafluoride, the hydrofluorocarbons, and the perfluorocarbons. Now, to make it easy to understand, they roll up all of those gases into one value, one unit called CO2e, which is a summary of all of them in terms of their impact if considered to be molecules of carbon dioxide.
What I want to know is how you work it all out.
By plane, we would have flown 1,063.68 kilometers each way. That's 20 seats, converted by a factor of 0.15573 kilograms of CO2e per kilometer. That's a total of 3,313 kilograms of CO2e each way. But for the train, It's 1,140.1 kilometres for 20 seats, converted by a factor of 0.00597 for international rail, plus 132.2 kilometres for 20 seats, converted by a factor of 0.04115 for national rail, which gives you a total of 244.93 kilograms of CO2e each way. That's a whopping mind-bending reduction of over 3 tonnes of CO2e.
How much gas is that?
1 kilogram of CO2 at sea level at about 27 degrees would fill 2 bathtubs. 1 tonne of CO2 occupies, give or take, an 8-metre cube. To make the point, they built one in 2009 at the UN climate talks in Copenhagen.
Can we do every tour like this?
Let's look at the realities about cost and time.
So I'm just going to stop the video there. You can see the full link when we get the slides afterwards. But really just wanted to show that as an example of a touring organization which really made this into a project and did some wonderful communication with it as well. A couple of other examples. This one is from a short filmmaking project production called The Last Harvest by Cracking Light Productions, and the production itself had an environmental theme, but they worked with an organization to understand the carbon impacts of their production. They worked it out across different types of impact. And I think what I really like here is that they have also shown, okay, so the total impact of that production was 6 tons. And they also showed that that was the equivalent of 2 round trip flights from London to Hong Kong. So kind of, giving a sense of context for those impacts as well. And you can access the full report and some lovely information about what they did on the link below. Another example from an international commission from the Stockton International Riverside Festival. This was a project called Within Without by Limbic Cinema, and they worked with a South Korean music duo and Full Tilt Aerial. They went and did a lot of work to understand the impacts. The South Korean musicians did all of the work virtually. So basically, they took a lot of different steps. And what they did was they worked out the impact of that commission compared to what they would have done normally. And that was a really useful approach for them in terms of understanding the impacts of their choices and the difference that they made. Another example from an organization, a multi-art center in Manchester, Home. They've been looking at their data for a long time. So they've been able to see how things have changed over time. They started including different sources of impact, so their footprint increased, as you can see in particular when they started measuring audience travel. And I think what's really nice is that they explain, okay, we have this information and this understanding, and this is how we're using it. And I will show you the short video. So again, I think I can't stress enough the importance of using the understanding and the data that you do have to inform action and to identify your priorities. Another short example here from Watershed, which is based in Bristol. They've been measuring their footprint for quite a long time, but it wasn't until more recently that they actually started to really dig into that, develop it, and really properly start to use it. And this final little video here I'm going to share with you is from Zoe Rabash from Watershed, which I think just really highlights the importance of using the information you have.
Hi.
Oop.
Hi, I'm Zoe. I'm climate action researcher at Watershed in Bristol. I'm just going to talk a little bit about how our carbon accounting process has informed what are now our climate action priorities. So I joined Watershed in early 2021 in the middle of a pandemic. But at that point, Watershed had been reporting to Arts Council and Julie's Bicycle for several years. But what the situation was is that because the work was being done, but only by a few people. And so while we were doing the carbon accounting, that information wasn't being relayed back into the organisation, to across staff members, to inform decision making. And there's no real point to doing the carbon accounting unless it's informing decision making. So at that time, we decided to set a new baseline year. We just declared a climate emergency. And so we were like, let's do this properly. And for the first time, we'll try and measure our scope 3 emissions, which we hadn't done before. So we worked with Earthly to do that first kind of initial footprint, which was going to be our baseline to reduce from. However, as this is our first foray into carbon accounting, the real process was learning about what the data that we didn't have. So it was a very incomplete picture. And it was really a process to learn, okay, who else needs to be involved in this data collection process across the organisation, and how can we do this better going forward? So we decided from there to work with a carbon consultant, CLD Carbon. But from that, we took that initial baseline, and so then we from that took some priorities. We had about 6 or 7 priorities. The difficulty with this was that because it was the first time we'd taken our scope 3 emissions, we didn't have anything to compare it to. So we ended up focusing a lot on travel, because a huge chunk of our footprint at that time was, it said it was international travel. And we were like, that's quite an easy one to reduce compared to other ones. So we were like, great, we'll focus a lot on travel. And we did. And then when we started working with a carbon consultant and we actually managed to pull together a few years of footprints, we realized, oh my God, 2018, 2019 was a kind of anomalous year because we were doing a project called Creative Producers International. So it was really not like any other year. We were just doing an unusual amount of flying that year. So we'd done all this good work on travel, which was great, but actually once we'd done this work with Craig, our carbon accountant, we had a few years of scope 1, scope 2 and scope 3 to compare. It was much easier to pull out what our key priorities should be, and now we only have 4 priorities that we're working on. Instead of spreading ourselves really thin and trying to do everything at once, we're just tackling the kind of big emitters. So for us, our four priorities are our building. The first one is our building. Around 38% of our emissions come from our heating, our energy, electricity use, and like the servers that we use. So our focus really is on figuring out a way to retrofit our building, and do this in a kind of creatively engaged way, future-proof cultural infrastructure against climate action, and kind of think about how we can build in inclusion and accessibility into how we're retrofitting our building as well, how we might contribute to kind of the ecology of Bristol city centre. But our building is a huge chunk, so it has to be kind of a key focus for us. The second one is procurement. A huge chunk of most of our footprint is procurement, almost, I think, 55%. And a huge chunk of that, the majority of that is from our food and drink in our cafe bar. And this was just really useful, even though it's really hard to bring down emissions from procurement and from buildings, actually, to be like, these are the 2 things that we need to focus on. We've done all the low-hanging fruit, and actually, as an organisation, we really need to strategize on how to reduce those. That was really important. The other 2 One of them is organizational change. We are able to do all of this stuff because we built a really strong basis of like organizational training. So we do have carbon literacy training, and also from doing this carbon accounting process, we have a really strong basis on which to build and do some of the more difficult stuff, the more difficult priorities, and we have to keep making sure that we're putting time and effort into maintaining that kind of strong basis for action.
So I think there's some great words of wisdom from Zoe there, really thinking about what information tells you, actually using it to set your priorities. And I think, again, you can watch the full video when you get the slides after today's session. A couple of other things just to say to wrap up this part. You can, if you have some good information, you can, if you have carbon footprint impact information, you can use it to tell your story. It could be internally, it could be externally. This is an example from a production called Green Space, Dark Skies. They did the footprint, but they also gave some really nice information, more kind of qualitative stuff in terms of food and which suppliers met their environmental procurement targets, and what kind of green accommodation they used. So the carbon metrics, absolutely, but it may not be that easy for all organizations, and there are other nice ways of telling, of sharing that information. And another example from a digital production called Can I Live? Where they did a report which had one page in it, which basically said a few of the key things which they had done in terms of what the impact were and what they had done to reduce them. So I am conscious of time and just wanted to wrap up with a few do's and don'ts in terms of understanding and measuring your impacts. The first key thing I would say is be smart, focus on key areas, especially if you're just starting out. Involve the people who have the information internally, or might be suppliers or the venues you're working with. Do think about what options you have for digging deeper through audits or surveys. Use existing tools, get help if you can. There is some freely available support available. Think about both qualitative and quantitative information in terms of building your understanding and measurements. Where possible, try and compare over time as your information and understanding develops, and try to compare like with like. This can be especially challenging for cultural organizations. Use the information you have to inform your action, and share and communicate that information definitely internally. And depending on what you do, you might want to think about some external sharing. In the terms of the don'ts, don't just dive in and get information or data because you can. If it's not an important area of impact, if there's not an awful lot you can do about it anyway, you're better off trying to focus on a few key areas. Unless you have some external help, don't try to measure everything all at once. Focus on the key things. You can always build up over time. Don't make the mistake of thinking, right, we've measured it, job done. It's what you do with that information which counts. And the final point is, even if you don't necessarily have all that impact data, don't let it stop you from taking action. If you have a good sense, you know what, this is an important area of impact, you can still do something about it without necessarily having the data. And then the last couple of things I just wanted to say was about different sources of support which are available from the Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland. There are the supports around getting energy audits done, where you can get a 2,000 voucher towards the cost of that, as long as you have a 10K minimum energy spend per year. There's also some support available from LEO, the local enterprise office, where you can get 2 days of support from a consultant who can provide some recommendations. And they're also providing some energy efficiency grants. So there are a lot of tools. There is some support and resource. You definitely don't need to start from the beginning. There's a lot to build on already. So that was it. Apologies for going slightly over time. Just to recap, of the next webinar coming up is on next week on the 2nd of July, and I'll be focusing on nature and biodiversity. And thank you for joining the webinar.